Hello, everyone, and welcome to this first event from Remixing the Classics Research Network. My name is Erin Sullivan, and I'm one of the co-chairs of Remixing the Classics, which is exploring how digital technologies are being used to remake and re-experience classic literature and drama. I want to start by thanking our funders, the UK's Arts and Humanities Research Council, our partner, the Association of Adaptation Studies, my co-chair, Deborah Cartmill, who you can see here, who you'll be hearing from in a few minutes, and our project assistant, Beth Sherrick, who's working with us to help make sure that this call runs as smoothly as possible. And also we'll be putting some links into the chat that you can follow if you'd like to find out more about some of the things being discussed. Please also feel free as audience members to use the chat constructively and respectfully during this event. And in fact, if you'd like, you can start now by letting us know where in the world you're listening from. Right now, I'm in Stratford-upon-Avon in the UK in my office at the Shakespeare Institute, which is part of the University of Birmingham. Before we get going with the seminar, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about Remixing the Classics and some of our upcoming events. At the heart of this project is an interest in what digital technologies bring artistically, pedagogically, politically to the retelling of old stories. So to get things started, we've programmed 5 free online seminars that will take place between now and June. You can see the flyer for the program through the link in the chat. Through the network, we want to bring academics, creative practitioners, teachers, cultural programmers, all different people into conversation with one another. We want to explore how digital adaptations can be used in the classroom, as well as what the barriers for doing so might be. We want to find out what excites creative writers, theater practitioners, and other artists about exploring the classics through digital technology. But again, what their concerns or their questions might be about this kind of work. You can read more about the project on our website, and you can also become part of the network yourself and also sign up for our mailing list by filling in the form here. There are already over 50 people involved in this network, and we hope to continue growing in the coming months. In July, we'll be hosting a hybrid workshop exploring the preliminary findings of our projects. It will take place in person in Birmingham, UK at the Exchange, which is a hub for public engagement and knowledge exchange, and it will also be streamed online. We'll have more details about that in the coming months. And after that, in August, we'll also be hosting an online conference on digital adaptations and putting together a special journal issue on the topic. I'm going to turn over now to my co-chair, Deborah Cartmill, to tell you a little bit more about that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Erin. The conference on the 4th of August will be receiving abstracts as well, and I think the deadline for that is the 1st of June. But we will accept abstracts with alacrity at any time after today. We're also very fortunate that the journal that I edit, adaptation, which is published by Oxford University Press, has agreed to a special issue. And so if there's anyone who wants to contribute to that, the deadline is officially the 1st of December, but it's an e-first publication so that you can send us an article, we can read it, and we can publish it well before that deadline. We'll be collecting we'll be collecting articles, and if we get too many, then we'll have a double issue, which will be double as good. So please think about contributing to that and coming along to the conference, which is under the auspices of the Association of Adaptation Studies on the 4th of August. So back to you, Erin.
Wonderful, thank you, Deborah. So finally, the last thing I wanted to say about the network is we also want to gather some insights into how online seminars and conferences like this one can be made as engaging, accessible, and sustainable as possible. So with this in mind, we've set up a short 6 or maybe 7 question survey, depending on if you answer the optional one at the end, that will appear at the end of this event. And we'd be really grateful if you could fill it in as you leave the Zoom call. In doing so, you'll help us understand how we can make these kinds of seminars better, and also help us give advice to other people who are interested in doing the same. So without any further ado, it's now my pleasure to turn our attention to today's seminar on video games and virtual worlds, and to welcome the wonderful trio of speakers who have generously agreed to share their work with us today. In 2014, I read a book by Stephen Jones called The Emergence of the Digital Humanities. And I distinctly remember him saying that if you want to engage with the most cutting-edge work in digital culture and creativity, then you need to look at video games and video game studies. Deborah and I were absolutely delighted when our three speakers agreed to be involved in this seminar. They've produced some of the most influential and exciting work on video game adaptations of classical literature and drama, as well as work on virtual and augmented reality adaptations that immerse participants in the world of classic texts. Together, they represent the disciplines of education, English, and drama, and we're hoping for a lively, interdisciplinary, and cross-professional conversation to emerge over the course of the next hour and 20 minutes or so. The format for today is that each of our guests will speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll use the second half of the seminar for discussion. And we hope that you, the audience, will get involved in that discussion. You can submit questions using the Q&A button in your Zoom toolbar, and you can also contribute comments and further thoughts in the chat. And in terms of questions, we'll save the discussion for the end, but feel free to type questions in as the speakers and talks are going, and then we can jump right in with discussion once we get to that second half. Please remember, of course, hopefully this doesn't need saying, to keep the tone of the chat respectful at all times. Deborah, Beth, and I will keep an eye on the Q&A and chat comments, and we'll draw on them when we get to the discussion portion of the seminar. But first, our speakers. I'm delighted to start by introducing our first speaker, Rebecca Bushnell, Emerita Professor of English at the University of Pennsylvania in the United States. She's the author of Tragic Time in Drama, Film, and Video Games, published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2016. A scholar of tragedy from Sophocles to Shakespeare, Rebecca has written about how playing serious video games deeply complicated her understanding of what she describes as the mechanisms of tragic necessity and the tragic protagonist's actions in time. In recent years, she's been looking at video game adaptations of Shakespearean tragedy, as well as adaptations of Shakespeare in virtual reality. In that work, she's discussed how looking at a play like Hamlet from the perspective of gaming can shed new light on the relationship between freedom and control and the way it shapes classical drama. So Rebecca, over to you.
So thank you so much, Erin and Deborah, and thank you, excuse me, for inviting me to this conversation. I am going to share my screen. If you give me a minute here, and we'll do this. Okay, and it's going to be my PowerPoint. Oh, click to exit. Hold on. Slideshow, play and start. How does that look, everybody? Does that look okay? Hold on, share. Okay, am I in there?
Wonderful, thank you.
Okay, so again, I'm delighted to be here to join this conversation about what digital technologies bring artistically, pedagogically, and politically to the retelling of old stories. This is actually a matter I've been thinking about for some time, dating back to the early 2010s when I began to write about the subject of tragedy and temporality. So I was focused then on how tragedy generates for characters, readers, and audiences alike the anxiety of existing in the present, trembling as it were between the past and the future. So what happened then is my daughter introduced me to video games while I was also watching time travel films. And it was really then that I came to see that when it comes to time and tragedy, the medium really matters. When in representing an old story or an old play, live theater, text, film, and video games all engage us differently in time while often recasting or remixing a story that we thought we knew. Oh dear. Uh-oh, this is not advancing. There we go. Sorry, I'm going to go back. So this research resulted in the book on tragic times in drama, film, and video games, and it's since launched me into more work on games and virtual reality, especially in connection with Shakespeare. So here I'm going to be drawing on some ideas from that book, but also a more recent essay on Hamlet and video games that I recently published in a book on games and theater in Shakespeare's England, edited by Tom Bishop, Erica Lynn, and Gina Bloom. So many of you here may indeed be gamers yourself, or at least you've tried some games. But I'm just going to say a few words about how I see video games as a form of theater. So as I wrote in Tragic Time, video games may lack live bodies to enact a story, but they do resemble theater when the avatar, the figure who acts out the story in the game, responds to the player's commands and interacts with the game environment in what feels like real time. And in such video games, you can say the player is simultaneously a playwright, a director, a character, an actor bringing the character life, but also a spectator who observes the action unfolding. So like most plays, video games are scripted in so far as they are complex programs. However, because they're meant to be games before anything else, video games always embed the possibility for multiple versions to emerge as a result of a player's actions. So in some games, these choices may create different versions of individual episodes or scenes affecting the process of playing, although the story will always end the same way. In other games, however, the player's actions can change the outcome. So what then has happened when Shakespeare's plays, classics for sure, have collided with video games? Jeffrey Way once noted that Shakespeare has not generated as many video games as one might expect, and he attributes this lack of games for the plays to the challenges of making Shakespeare-based games that operate within as video games and also as a recognizably Shakespearean experience. How that is, how can something that we know as well as Shakespeare have the openness of a game and still be Shakespeare? Oops. Now, there have been several video games based on Hamlet, and this is just a list of them so far. First, Hamlet, a Murder Mystery, dated back on 1997, which was actually based on Kenneth Branagh's film of Hamlet. Robin Johnson's Hamlet, the Text Adventure from 2003, alas, no longer available on the internet. Hamlet or the Last Game from 2010. Ryan North's To Be or Not to Be, which started as a novel in 2013 and became a game in 2015, and most recently Elsinore. Now, each of these games varies in the way in which it diverges from the play itself and how it allows the ending to turn out differently. And I'd be delighted, of course, to talk about all of them. But here I have time only to discuss one, which is Elsinore, the most recent one. So the game Elsinore was developed by Katie Coronas and designed by Connor Fallon and a team at Golden Glitch, and as I said, released in 2019. And in this game, the play's avatar is Ophelia, given the opportunity to avert Hamlet's catastrophes. And as the website describes the game, on a summer night, the Danish noblewoman Ophelia awakens from a terrible vision. In 4 days, everyone in Elsinore Castle will be dead. Even worse, she's been thrown into a time loop from which she cannot escape. Forced to relive the same 4 days over and over again, Ophelia determines to do everything in her power to change the future. So Elsinore first seeks to remake the world of Elsinore Castle itself. So Ophelia and Laertes are now biracial. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are female scholars of color, and surprisingly enough, Othello is available to assist Ophelia. As you can see here, the image of some of the characters from the game. However, the game is also means to transform tragedy itself by crossing it with video gaming, both by using the game mode of the replay or time loop and by adapting the model of the stealth character who operates in the game world not in direct combat, but rather indirectly or secretly. So the gameplay involves moving Ophelia through the various spaces of Elsinore Castle, like here in the Great Hall, where she interacts with other characters during a time-limited period. At the end of the 4 days, she or others may die, but she will wake again to start a new series of days. And if you play the game long enough and make the right choices, she might indeed save Elsinore from disaster, although there are 12 possible endings, depending on the choices that you make. So as a reviewer, Karen Pettit had described the gameplay in Elsinore, you don't change the course of events by poisoning people's goblets or stabbing them in the back with daggers, although your actions may get other people to do such things. You do it so by gathering information, often by eavesdropping on conversations or then deciding when or whom to share that information. As you can see here from this slide, the player keeps a list of information to share and builds on that over the process of the gameplay. So as Kionis has commented on the game's origins, when she was both reading tragedies in school and playing video games, she thought, what if we combine this concept of the game power fantasy when all you do is win, 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 with a tragedy where all you do is lose, lose, lose. So Kionis argues that Ophelia's minor role in Hamlet makes her the right choice to enact a new kind of balance between tragedy and the power of games by acting as that ideal stealth character who was invested with the ability to avert the catastrophe embedded in the story of Hamlet. So in this sense, Elsinore's developers saw themselves as rethinking the whole concept of the gamer's agency in the context of a classical tragedy. Where they did want to grant Ophelia agency to change the course of events in the play, they also wanted to undercut what they call the power fantasy of gaming with its winning through violence. At the same time, the principle of the game is still that Ophelia may save Elsinore as she takes what she learns from going back in time to try a different strategy to unfold the story in multiple ways. So in the short time I have left, let me just share a few thoughts extending from these notes about Elsinore, about how the mechanism and approaches of video gaming can open up how we think about a classic play like Hamlet. So as Roger Caillois reminds us in his book on Man, Play, and Games, all games are partially defined by conditions of uncertainty. After all, the pleasure and the challenge of game playing are that you don't know how it's all going to turn out. Of course, a traditional view of Hamlet as a tragedy focuses on the outcome, as Hamlet's ultimately assenting to his destiny to avenge his father's death and accept his own. However, refracting Hamlet through video gaming instead suggests the characters might be operating in a more open than closed world, one defined by uncertainty and indirection rather than fatality, one of what Horatio at the play's end calls mischance, accidental judgments, casual slaughters. And indeed, things might have turned out otherwise, for indeed at least one of Shakespeare's sources for this play, the French writer Albert Fauré's Histoire Tragique, Hamlet doesn't die when he achieves his revenge. Rather, he violently severs Claudius's head, burns down the palace, and lives to reign as king. Indeed, I will also remind you that Shakespeare himself, not just here, but elsewhere, was not averse to changing the original stories on which he based his own plays. See King Lear. So video game Hamlet thus underlines how the play's events can be seen as unfixed and contingent, even while the tragic machine grinds on. I think video games make us question whether we really knew what the story was in the first place. So thanks for listening. I'll stop my share now.
Great. Thank you so much, Rebecca. That was wonderful. Excellent. Yeah, so we'll do a virtual applause and we'll do a big round of applause for everyone at the end. But thank you so much. Again, if people think of questions as we're going, please feel free to put them in the Q&A and we'll save them up for when we get to discussion. But I'm going to move on now to our next speaker, E.B. Hunter, Assistant Professor of Drama at Washington University in St. Louis in the United States. Elizabeth is creator of several digital adaptations of classic literature and drama, including Something Wicked, based on Shakespeare's Macbeth, Bitter Winds, a Greek tragedy in mixed reality, based on the story of Agamemnon and Clytemnestra in Greek literature and drama, and also another project that we're going to hear a bit more about today. Elizabeth has described her creative projects as a form of critical making that allows artists and users to explore the inner workings of classic texts. In her writing, she's argued that digital adaptations can, in her words, collapse the spectator into an actor, and that they allow access to characters' subject positions in a way not achievable with other media. But thank you so much, Elizabeth, for being here today, and I'll turn over to you.
Thanks very much. And now I'll get my screen to share, and we'll see how that works. All right. How's that?
Perfect.
Is that good? Thank you, Andrew. And everybody. So hi, first of all, thanks for having me here. I'm delighted to be here with Andrew and Rebecca on this panel, both of whom their work I have followed for years and whose work makes mine even feasible. And so I owe a huge debt of gratitude to both of my co-panelists today. And thanks also Erin and Deborah for putting this whole shebang together. I'm excited to see the rest of the talks that I'll be awake for here in the United States. So I really kind of leaned into Erin's invitation to focus on a specific element of a project and talk about the most recent project that I've built called Reason Not the Need, which is not a video game per se, but a lot of the lessons in designing and building this project came from what we learned from building Something Wicked, the Macbeth video game, which is a free download from my website if anybody wants to play it. But I thought it might be an interesting complement, since you can read about Something Wicked and the design process behind it in an article that's out. I thought I would talk today about the process of building Reason Not the Need, and also the technology of augmented reality, which is what I'm spending a ton of time thinking about right now. So this is a mobile augmented reality adaptation of the thunderstorm scene from William Shakespeare's King Lear. And this app uses augmented reality on your phone or your iPad to populate the user's space with holograms of, like you can see here, King Lear, who was captured in volumetric video, the Fool, who's on the left in the green, modeled in, I think the student designing that used Blender, and other graphics like the lightning, which you can't really, the lightning wasn't bursting in this screenshot, but the rain you can see. And our goal was to turn private space into a stormy heath. Oh, and in the opening moments, it also uses facial mapping to add a crown to the user's head. And I'm clearly way too happy to be in an authentic production of King Lear here in this screenshot. But my lab called Fabulab, so exciting to be presenting to a crowd who will get that joke and not have to have it explained, instead of folks who are like, oh, Fabulab because it's fabulous. I mean, yes, but not really. Our lab, Fabulab, designed and created Reason from June of 2020 to May of 2021, entirely remotely. The project was a collaboration with Jo Cattell, who is a directing fellow at the Goodman Theater in Chicago, and her work integrates immersive technology and theater. With Aldo Billingsley, who's here playing Lear, who's a professional actor in the Bay Area and professor of acting at Santa Clara University. As well as faculty in my previous department at San Francisco State University, which was where I was on faculty before coming to WashU when we designed and built this prototype, as well as student research assistants at State from theater, computer science, film and media studies, and the business school. Reason Not the Need was supported by the Illinois Arts Council, the CSU Entertainment Alliance, and Marcus undergraduate research grants at San Francisco State University. So we built a prototype of this thunderstorm scene as a proof of concept for the director, Jo Cattell, to use in order to source funding for the full-length version of the production that she was planning to build for the theater industry. And this opportunity to build the prototype was really an ideal sandbox experience for the students, for Jo, and for the experimentation that I do in my research. And I think it's an example of the kind of partnership between academia and the creative industries that really just sings. And the goal with Jo aesthetically for the larger project was to implicate the audience in the arrogance and the despair of our famous Mad King. And her longer adaptation envisions a Lear whose misuse of technology leads to his estrangement from society, his abandonment by family, and eventually his madness. And my lab, Fabulab, bit off the chunk that dovetails with the strand of my research that uses digital technology to explore the dramaturgy of famous production problems in theater. And so in Reason, obviously that production problem was the thunderstorm scene in Lear. And in my, the first project like this that I built, that Aaron mentioned, Something Wicked, the Macbeth video game, that production problem was on stage blood in Macbeth, because you need so much. And it turns into a convergence of dramaturgy and budget and ruining all the clothes and aesthetics that I talk about in the article that came out about Something Wicked. But I used the video game format to think through that problem. You can have as much blood as you want in a video game. And then in the next project after that, which was Bitter Wind, I used headset-based augmented reality, which is the HoloLens, which I actually have one back here sitting on my desk. You put it on and you can see the world around you still with holograms kind of populating it. But the production problem I was working through was how to emphasize on stage the slow passage of time when you're besieged by embodied memories that are visible, but they aren't ghosts. And that play, of course, is Agamemnon. But in Reason, in addition to using new technology as a way to rethink this famous production problem of creating an effective thunderstorm, This project explored how in the pandemic's seclusion, which was especially pronounced in Northern California, which was where we all were, where we were building this project, our design goals were to explore themes of isolation and madness and the ways in which immersive connected technologies can turn vulnerable private space into theatricalized space. So as some of the folks who are listening in probably already know, theater and performance works created with augmented reality technologies have existed for several years. But these projects were kind of niche and experimental until the pandemic came along and closed down the theater industry and made everyone a lot more interested in using remote digital technologies like video games and augmented reality and virtual reality to make work that you can sell tickets to and give actors work doing. So as these vital elements of augmented reality specifically fall into place, like the partnership between Punch Drunk, who made Sleep No More and a lot of other projects. I know their Burnt City is up right now, I think in London, which I would love to hear about if anybody happens to have seen that. They're partnering with Niantic, who created Pokemon Go, which you might have seen, and also some Harry Potter adaptation. I don't remember the name of it. But not Pokemon Go is the $5 billion game franchise that came out 5 years ago. $5 billion a quote. That's not metaphorical. They've made $5 billion with Pokemon Go in the last 5 years. But they're partnering with Punch Drunk in order to build theatrical video game experiences for their real world platform. So as that piece of this AR tech infrastructure falls into place, and also when AR glasses finally become consumer grade, these experiments in augmented reality and performance that have been niche are going to become broadly accessible really fast. And so I think that scholarly engagement with augmented reality as an emergent tool for thinking about theater and performance and literature has become really urgent. So when we turn to the discussion part of this panel after Andrew's talk, I want to offer two provocations from an article that I just finished about augmented reality and how we're making and analyzing this work, because the ways in which this technology makes meaning are really different from other born digital theatrical forms like Zoom or a video game or a virtual reality, although you could have a video game and augmented reality. And the first of those is that augmented reality is especially well suited for design that integrates a semiotic approach with critical literature that is related to the source narrative. And then this combination is especially effective for navigating sources where multiple versions compete as the authentic version. So the classicists here know that in the mythos, any given version has any number, and any given mythos has any number of variations, which usually revolve around elements that are easy to depict. Like it's an apple in this version, it's a pomegranate in this version. If Iphigenia is murdered in this version, she is replaced with a deer in this version. But because the nature of augmented reality is such that designers pick only some elements of a source to turn into the holograms that stand out against your analog background, this semiotics-led approach, is my contention, allows us to have a design argument that prioritizes one version over another, or emphasizes latent elements of the source or production problems, like I did with the Macbeth video game. And this is also how I chose which holograms to build for Bitter Wind, where the sad girl is pulling focus from the more familiar stage semiotics of the Agamemnon mythos, like a door and a bathtub and tapestries. In my version, the girl takes, she pulls focus. And the second of these provocations is that I would want to encourage designers and scholars to foreground the porousness of augmented reality as a technology and the way its holograms haunt the space that you're in. So I've seen a lot of experiments, early experiments that just kind of relocate a pre-recorded enclosed performance to augmented reality. And then the user's surroundings are visible in the background, but they're not really integrated as part of the story space. And I think that design really only uses AR as a novelty and misses the opportunity to engage its affordances meaningfully. So I would encourage as we move forward in designing our games and designing theatrical projects with augmented reality specifically, I would love for folks to lean into that future where our own environments are haunted by Greek tragedy, by thunderstorms, and by whatever story kind of materialized on our walls and that we participated in. That's what I have for you today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. I'm making lots of notes as everyone talks, lots of things to discuss, and another round of virtual applause. I'm going to move next to Andrew for our final talk, and then we'll go into that discussion. And thank you for raising those provocations, Elizabeth. For Andrew, I'm going to play a video. He's done a pre-recorded video of his talk, both for connectivity, security, but also because there's some video elements that he wants to play and share with you, and it can be a little bit tricky going in and out of those in Zoom. So in a moment, I'll share my screen and run that video. But first, I'll introduce Andrew, who is here with us live as well, and will be involved in the discussion. Our final speaker is Andrew Byrne, who's Professor of English, Media and Drama at UCL's Institute of Education in London. His book, Literature, Video Games and Learning, published by Routledge last year, argues that video games are not so different from earlier literary traditions, and that, quote, poetry itself is a form of play. He's described video games as digital rhapsodies made up of what he describes as the syntax of language, the grammar of visual action, the conditional mood of code. And Andrew has led a series of important projects exploring video games, classic literature, and English education. And he's also developed a tool called Mission Maker, which allows students to create their own games based on classic texts, including Beowulf and Macbeth. And we'll hear more about that in just a minute. So everyone cross their fingers for me. And I'm going to share my screen and hopefully optimize the video properly. Okay.
So I'm going to show two video captures of game levels designed by 14-year-old girls in an East London school using software we designed in our lab called Mission Maker, a Unity-based game authoring tool. You can see some examples of projects that we've done based on Beowulf and Macbeth, and I owe thanks to Stellar Wisdom at the British Library for collaboration, and to Erin, who helped us judge our national video game competition based on Macbeth. So the girls have been allocated particular scenes from Macbeth by their teacher, Alison Crosdale, who's also studying their work as part of her PhD project. So I want to pose two questions. The first is, how might this help not just the students, but also us to think differently about the plays, to think about them as games? And secondly, what kinds of remix, to directly address the topic of our seminar series, are in evidence here? First example then is Joanne's game, and it's based on the murder of Lady Macduff and her son. So she's searching for a way to offer the player some kind of choice, some kind of way to engineer a multiple narrative. She homes in on the final stage direction that you can see here. She realizes that it offers a kind of loose end in the text, a kind of lacuna. Is Lady Macduff actually killed by the murderers? Or might she possibly escape? The function of stage directions, by the way, is interesting here. I've just noted Sarah Dustiger and Gillian Wood's comment about these, that stage directions take us to the heart of how meaning is made in plays, precisely because they foreground the dynamic between text and performance. And I think Joanne's game precisely exploits this dynamic, using it to prise open the text, to re-engineer the narrative, to offer the player some possibility of escape. I'll just play you the video capture of her game and talk you through it. So here you can see we arrive in the game as Lady Macduff, and Joanne has chosen an appropriate digital body to function as our avatar. So we run up the stairs, we open the door, we see the dead body of her child. We pass through the courtyard of the castle into the woods where we eventually see the murderers who will attack us. You can see the avatar's health bar at the top left of the screen, reduced with each attack. In this play sequence, in fact, the health bar is exhausted and the avatar dies. However, it could keep on running. So Joanne has combined two design features of the game to produce this choice between dying and running. The narrative space of the woods and the heath, which give us space to run, and the programming of the murderer. And here you can see the property panel of this character from the design interface, where she's chosen to program the character to follow the player and also to be aggressive. So then she's re-engineered the narrative, as I've suggested, to offer the player choice to be killed, or perhaps a worse fate, to be condemned to an endless running, an endless flight. She later on told Alison that she'd been influenced in her design by a popular mobile phone game, which perhaps some of you know, Temple Run, a running game in which you run from temple to temple, finding treasure and escaping monsters. So here's the second example. This is Leanne's game, and she's been allocated the murder of Banquo. Once again, she's chosen a small fragment as a way in, and once again, her interest is in the ludic narrative, finding possibilities for multiple routes. So she finds a scrap of dialogue which suggests that there might be a quality of empathy in the second murderer, who she has decided might then choose to show mercy to Fleance and allow him to escape. I'll just play you a short video clip in which she talks about her idea.
Murder number 2 seems more like he's trying to resolve the situation and seems to try to calm both of them down. So he seems the most sympathetic out of both of them. So how about we make sure that murderer number 2 is the traitor of the group, and he eventually lets Fleance escape. And the avatar is set in the body of the murderer number 3. The 2 murderers were supposed to go and kill Banquo, and while the 2 murderers were killing Banquo, one of the murderers, us, we were supposed to chase after Fleance while he ran away, and there's going to be this big elaborate chasing of the us and Fleance, and then it reached a point where we realized that we feel guilty for Fleance, of the guilt of the whole situation, and the avatar is given a choice of whether to kill Fleance or to let him live. And depending on which one he chose, at the end of the day, Fleance will still escape. But if the avatar was to pick to let him go, the avatar had to go back to the murderers and lie to them, telling them that he escaped out of our reach when we let him go by ourselves.
But who told you to come join us?
Macbeth.
We can trust him. He's been given the same instructions as us.
Then stay then. It is still light. Everyone is going home, and the one we should look out for should be near.
So, like Joanne's, her design begins with a kind of instrumental reading to re-engineer the mechanics of the narrative, perhaps recalling what Louise Rosenblatt called efferent reading, to prise open the text and insert her desired alternative routes. However, Alison asks them to follow up with a piece of creative writing, and this leads to something which is closer to the category of aesthetic reading, which Rosenblatt emphasized with its strong sense of affective engagement. Startlingly, in this, she has replaced the beefy warrior of her digital model with her own image. "Who sent you?" he says. This is one of the murderers talking to you as the avatar. "Scanning me, trying to decipher why a young lady such as myself would have any business with such. 5'9", curly brown bush heaped into a high ponytail by my cocoa-toned skin. Outcast by society due to my appearance, I've been forced to go into the streets, stealing and selling, just to get by with my pure hatred for the world." So she fills out the simple receptacle of the avatar with her own image and story. remixing the tragic backstories of the murderers with her own concerns of gender and ethnicity. Her reimagining recalls perhaps Maya Angelou's well-known provocation, paraphrased here by Juliet Fleming. William Shakespeare was a black woman, for he had marvellously understood and written about her outcast state. So, how might this help us to think about the play differently? We could think about it as already game-like. How is it like a game, a series of missions for the protagonist to accomplish? How is it procedural, in the sense that Ian Bogost and Janet Murray describe? How is it made up of units managed by rules? How might it be seen as play, especially in respect of the categories which Roger Caillois, the play theorist, identifies, mimicry and agon? How might it be seen as outward-facing, offering what Astrid Enslin calls the textual you of video games, offering the reader or spectator or player a point of access or purchase, a point of entry to inhabit the character? And secondly, then, my other question, how might the games exhibit forms of remix? So in the study of literacy in the wider context of youth culture, practices of remix and mashup are common and have been extensively described by people like Henry Jenkins and Mizuko Ito. Obvious underpinning of this idea is Levi-Strauss's bricolage. So to see these girls as bricoleurs takes us some way in understanding their playful interventions. But it's not the whole story. We remember that Levi-Strauss opposed his image of the bricoleur to the image of the engineer, the savage mind, as he called it, as opposed to the scientific mind. So I want to suggest that the creative bricolage here, the remix of stories, fiction, autobiography, elite and popular cultural fragments, blood and horror, is interdependent with cool critical thought, logical justifications, and in fact actual engineering in the form of computer programming. In terms of the curriculum, we could see game design as a meeting place between computing and the STEM curriculum and the arts. So, literature remade through game design requires efferent and aesthetic reading in its literate procedures, and both bricolage and engineering in its forms of creative design. Thanks very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Andrew. Excellent. Great, and thank you so much to the panel. So we can now properly have a nice round of applause, physical or emoji version, whatever seems most appropriate wherever you all are and in whatever context. But thank you all so much for sharing your work with us and for bringing so many different perspectives to bear on the conversation. So again, I want to invite audience members to feel free to ask questions. We'll see them most easily if you put them in the Q&A button, but we'll also keep an eye on the chat. I thought I'd start with quite a broad question, which is about why maybe there aren't more video game adaptations, and maybe I might say commercial video game adaptations of classic texts. And I suppose a kind of obvious answer is maybe they don't make money. But I'm thinking about the fact that, certainly in the 90s and into the first decade of the 2000s, there are so many film adaptations of classic texts, and we still see that today. So I'm wondering why there isn't a kind of parallel trend, or if there is and I've just somehow missed it.
I don't know. I mean, there's a marvelous collection that came out a couple of years ago called Classical Antiquity in Video Games that tracks specifically ancient sources in video games. And so I'm not sure that there are necessarily as many Shakespeare video games as the Shakespeareans among us are astonished that there aren't Shakespeare video games. But I think there actually are a fair number of classical antiquity video games. Certainly the Assassin's Creed franchise looks at, I mean, they're not doing a one-to-one translation of the dramas, but there's a lot of work on historical sources taken to that big franchise level. I think maybe more, but that's a really good collection to start looking at. I had it on my shelf, but I'm realizing I had to send it back. So I don't have my own copy of it, but it's called Classical Antiquity in Video Games. So I think that there's been a pretty decent representation, but maybe more on the side of, and that maybe is because there's a more robust around literature about the wars, and war translates into video games pretty nicely, and we don't get to see all the big battles necessarily on the stage in Shakespeare's plays. There's kind of, they're quieter stories. Henry, and the history plays notwithstanding. But I think it's out there, maybe just not Shakespeare, not as much as there should be.
And I would add, yes, I was thinking absolutely of the Assassin's Creed games and the ways in which, for example, the Assassin's Creed Odyssey one, or that video games adapt themselves to the creation of ancient worlds or classical worlds, as it were. And the same could be true, for example, think about how much of video games are also based in images of medieval worlds and the recreation of worlds. And of course, there's the huge amount of games that are dedicated to replaying wars, historical battles, which, interestingly enough, if the argument would be, well, we don't do them based on Shakespeare plays because, as I said, everybody knows how the Shakespeare, plays turn out. Why are there so many video games based on history which explore the opportunities of alternative history and let you replay battles? So there's something is at stake there between the way that the stories that we thought we always knew are being approached and the ways that video games have grappled with history.
Yeah, can I just add, I think Rebecca's point about the kind of neo-medievalisms is a really important one. You think of Game of Thrones, but so, I mean, in relation to that, I was just going to mention the sort of vast and sprawling role-playing game genre and games related to that, which in effect all come from Tolkien, and therefore eventually actually all come from Beowulf. So, you get Beowulf through Tolkien into that whole genre, and then into specific adventure games, which are adapted from Tolkien's stories themselves. So there's that kind of lineage, I think, which does play out. The other thing I was thinking is that there is a kind of commercial and technological set of practicalities at work. So I was thinking of the Beowulf game, which was based on the Robert Zemeckis animated film based on Beowulf. And that was a kind of easy transition because the Zemeckis film was used motion capture animation. So the digital models were kind of already ready there to be turned into a video game. And also the voice acting that was contributed by various people to that film, including Anthony Hopkins, for instance, was also easily transferable into the video game. So you can see why that happened. But there are other games, of course, based on Dante's Inferno and Alice in Wonderland, and even Atlas Shrugged, actually, all kinds of. So there are probably more than we think, I guess. But still, I think, as Elizabeth said, why are there not more Shakespeare games?
I think that also for Shakespeare games specifically, which of course there should be lots more of, that the elephant in the room that we kind of tangled with head on in Something Wicked is the barrier to comprehension that the language presents, which has always been present with non-specialists. And so specialists no longer even see that. And I think when you are in a context like Andrew has been in, where you're taking the source and talking about it with 7th graders or with people who aren't predisposed to, like a bunch of engineers who didn't want to take a Shakespeare class but had to check it off on their requirements list. I think that there's a barrier to enjoyment that the language has always presented that isn't a part of the equation with ancient Greek and Roman, with Beowulf. Nobody's reading it in Old English. All these other works that we've been talking about, all are available in translation. And, kind of the study aids of No Fear Shakespeare and everything aside, which I am always a huge proponent of, that that chunk of like, in order to understand the plot and get to the plot, I have to get through this tangle of language is, I think that's not a small contribution to why there's not more popular engagement with Shakespeare's plays.
That's really interesting. Thank you all. And it's wonderful because it reminds me, being a Shakespearean, sometimes I overlook for Shakespeare, and to be reminded of the other places, the other classics that are, producing really fruitful engagements is really helpful, and is exactly one of the reasons why we started this network. So thank you for that. I think, Deborah, at one point, did you have a question? I saw your first hand go up.
I did have a question, and I'm seeing that we're getting some pouring in too. So just before we go into the into the Q&A session, I just wondered. I mean, Rebecca showed us a lovely still from Laurence Olivier's 1948 Hamlet, which has had a remarkably long shelf life, when you think about it. And we still, I think, sometimes we think about Hamlet, we think about Laurence Olivier's Hamlet. And I just wonder about video games. Do they have the potential to have that long shelf life, to become sort of classics in their own right? Or is technology moving too quickly for them to be the one and only kind of version of the of the text, so the text that kind of survives the source?
Interesting question.
Well, I mean, as I pointed out, at least one of the games that I'm talking about in the article that I wrote on Hamlet video games has disappeared. It's no longer there. So they literally can, at these kinds of games that are often generated for the internet and only have that digital life, can disappear. So that's, there on the one hand side. You can say on the other side, I mean, a game that I've been thinking about that I've actually also written about are the Witcher games, which again create that great neo-medieval world. And Witcher 3, there's actually a production of a quasi-Shakespearean play in the course of that game. And that game is very, I think, conscious both of its own evocation of this world, but also of its theatrical game-like status. And so, certain games themselves have become classics. And of course, they get played and replayed and reinvented and modded and transformed in ways in which they remind us. I always think they remind us of the fact that the Shakespeare plays themselves have been remade, modded, transformed. Unlike the Olivier's film, which sort of exists out there, caught in crystal on film until that film itself degenerates. But I think to me, it's both the danger, but also the power of video games is they have that malleability and ability to be transformed and adapted and modded, that they don't have the permanence of the Olivier film, and which you can say is both, a loss, but I think also a tremendous gain.
Yeah, I mean, they're hard to preserve, and I think curators always have this huge problem. I mean, what do you preserve? Is it the hardware? Is it the software? Is it the concept art or whatever? So that is certainly a big problem. But another problem, which a student I once had, Luke Kelly, who I co-supervised with Steve Connor at Cambridge, raised was, our games kind of subject to a sort of endless kind of improvement, technological improvement, which renders previous versions of them sort of obsolete. And he conceived of this under the idea of what he called ideality, that they're constantly striving for technological improvement or improvement in kind of representational, technologies like graphics. So the Witcher series, for example, which is sort of brilliantly kind of realized graphically, does that mean that all the games which look clunky will become superseded and forgotten? And I don't think they will, actually, because you take a classic game like Final Fantasy VII, which fans still remember and love and see as a kind of classic of the Japanese console role-playing game type, even though you look back on this and the graphics are kind of clunky and doll-like. It seems to me that a game like that will always be fondly remembered in the same kind of way as, cinema technologies, which have been superseded, will always have a kind of aesthetic appeal, and perhaps can be recaptured through sort of nostalgic retro cultural processes as well, actually.
Great, thank you. Well, like Deborah said, we've got some great questions. So I'll go ahead and start asking some of those. We have two questions from Ariel Dagan, and I'll ask one to start with. They're both about education and the classroom. So I think they might be mostly directed at you, Andrew, although Elizabeth, they might also be of interest to you. So we'll just see. And Ariel asks, how do you balance between the class time it takes to design, edit, and produce the video games by students versus the time spent teaching text and perhaps additional texts?
Yeah, I think my answer to that is always that it's the same time. You don't need to teach the text and then make the video game. I mean, you can do them together, and they support each other. Also, I would say that, you know, our kind of motivation in designing softwares like this is to make them easy to use. You know, we've compared them, for instance, to Scratch, where kids have to, you know, produced by MIT, where kids have to basically learn programming before they can move the turtle from one corner of the screen to the other. Whereas with ours, the kids can pick it up in a matter of half an hour. So those games that were made by the kids in London were made in a one-day off timetable session.
Yeah, I think that learning from the lessons of Andrew's project, which I read about when I started working on Something Wicked pretty extensively, because I knew that in terms of the design of the project itself, I was writing dissertation also. And so this was my side hustle. And so I couldn't drill down into making a whole suite of stuff and also Andrew had already done that. Like that project didn't need to be redone again. And so I thought about ways that I could create something that would just be supplemental rather than being an all-encompassing lecture. And so in terms of the depth as a pedagogical tool, the depth of knowledge of the text that students get after working through the process that Andrew has set up is extremely robust. And mine is meant to be worked in 5 minutes as opposed to, so you won't get as deep and a dive into the dramaturgy and to moving across media, but they're doing different, they're serving different functions in a classroom. And that was actually the next step for me with Something Wicked, which has kind of been sitting peacefully on its shelf for the past couple of years, has always been to think about testing it as, I'm not a learning sciences person. I'm a theater person and a technology person in theater. So I'm in the classroom, but I'm not a learning sciences person. But we noticed when we were beta testing it, that we were in a space where there were lots of engineers. And so we would grab these computer engineers or other kinds of engineers and say, hey, what do you think about Shakespeare? And they're like, and we said, well, read this passage, read Act 1, Scene 2, which is the Norwegian invasion, and tell us what you think, and then play this video game, which is the Something Wicked turns that into a playable thing, that turns the battle into something that you play, the 4 levels, and it stays everything. You can't diverge from the narrative and the source. You have to play the way the battles roll out in 1, 2. And we saw, this was just totally informal, but we saw all of these lights going off in the minds of engineers. And they were like, wait a minute, I actually understand what's going on in this monologue now. And now I want to read the rest of it. And I see how you got the sparrows and the hares and the eagles. And there's the sword, which is smoking with bloody execution. And especially if they were gamers, they could sense that we were speaking to gamers also, that you could kill the bad guys, the Kerns and the Gallowglasses. You could kill them faster if you stabbed them in the back. And gamers could feel that mechanic. And so then they started asking, is this a play about backstabbing? It's like, yes, it is. And then Banquo had an AI script where he wouldn't get out of Macbeth's way. And so then they started asking, who's this guy? I hate this guy. I want to kill this guy. And we're like, you do? But so thinking about how to drive their experience towards comprehension and affinity was a goal for that project that I think it's just doing different kinds of work, but they can both be valuable in a classroom setting.
Brilliant, thank you. The next question is specifically for Rebecca. It's from Paulina, and she says, thank you so much for your paper. And then she says she's not acquainted with the game Elsinore, hence the question. So she asks, how is our desire for tragic outcomes incorporated into the contingent world of the game? Or does the game make you try hard to avoid tragedy?
That's a wonderful question, and one that I thought about, and also being aligned with the pleasures of gaming, because there are two kinds of, you can say, pleasures of, gaming is all about winning and getting to the end. And so there are different kinds of ways of winning, you can say. I mean, it was interesting the way that the Robin Johnson game, the lamentable text adventure of Hamlet, ended. It could only end with you're dying as Hamlet. And so when you finally get to the point, and it doesn't give you any other alternative but to die, and then at the point in which you die, the player is told, you've completed 100% of this adventure. Horatio rates you with the very ecstasy of love. And so there, the concept of actually, as it is in some sense with the ending of Hamlet itself, of giving in, of let be, as it were, of giving in to the experience of your own death and the pleasures of the tragedy, become rewarded, because that's also in that game the form of winning the game. Now, again, what the other games do, so in comparison, to be or to be or not to be game differently, rewards you in different ways. If you for all the different kinds of endings, on the one hand, if you choose to go in a direction where you have a just ending, where Claudius is adjudged to be guilty in a court of law, you're given justice points, but very few adventure points. So you were judged to have a different kind of experience, as opposed to your acceding to the tragic ending, which is aligned with Shakespeare's ending, but you don't get very much in terms of game rewards, as opposed to other kinds of experiences. So it's very much in games baked into the whole reward and pleasure systems that are inherent in games themselves.
Thank you. The next question is from Julie, who says she loved all of the papers and she thanks everyone so much. And then she asks, kind of moving from games to film, but maybe back again. She asks if the speakers have any thoughts on Joel Cohen's The Tragedy of Macbeth, whose sense of space felt to me, or to her, to be very virtual. And another broad question she has was inspired by Elizabeth's discussion of materiality. Do any of the panelists have any further thoughts about the paradox of the virtual space and the body or affect or experience of materiality? So there's a lot in there, and I suppose maybe the kind of question is about, how a digital space renders the physical. If we, I don't know, I suppose riffing on it with my own thoughts, the kind of, do we see this as a kind of binary, or do they sort of enmesh one another? And I'm thinking about Elizabeth talking about porousness. And if anyone's seen Cohen's The Tragedy of Macbeth and wants to comment on it, likewise in the comments, that'd be great.
I think that the Cohen Macbeth, which I thought he was very brave to call it Joel Cohen's Tragedy of Macbeth, especially because the staging to me seemed to be a direct update of the Orson Welles kind of ponderous film. But I think that the notion of video games existing as a digitally rendered space, one of the reasons that theater people a lot of times like talking about video games and also virtual and augmented reality technologies is that we're very familiar with the language of surrealism and symbolism, as opposed to going for historical realism in depiction. And so I think that the theater at Metacausi said this way back in 1999, those halcyon days of 1999, that there's nothing that has happened in a virtual reality space that the theater hasn't already done, because the theater is the original virtual reality space. And so I think that there's a lot of ways in which the language of theater and performance and kind of the technical vocabulary we use maps onto these questions of video games and embodiment and participation and spectatorship, especially as these technologies kind of leak out or break out from the screen and attach themselves to the body. like augmented reality work, or like, John Parker Starbucks, cyborg technology, like cyborg performance, that thinking about as computing becomes embedded and moves from Stelarc's wild experiments to something that becomes mass marketed, like the Internet of Things, and having health trackers on you all the time, that technology is no longer restricted behind this Zoom panel notwithstanding, that it's no longer restricted behind, or the digital technology behind the screen. And so questions of materiality and technology are really important going forward. So I think that that's a really great question. So I don't remember who asked that, but thank you for asking
Really
that
good
question.
Can I just add, I think there's also something about, I really agree with all that, and I think it's absolutely right that it's already happened on the stage, and it's already happened in Shakespeare's text, of course, and, the characters musing on the artifice of theatre, including Macbeth's at the end of the play, or Hamlet's on the play within a play, and all the other plays within plays in Shakespeare already kind of in a way make that point. But in respect of the digital body, there's also something about the work of the imagination which has to kind of animate these digital artifacts. I mean, there's been a lot of work on the way in which when you play a digital body, you kind of project yourself in, as James G describes it, into the body of the avatar in imagination. And something which I think responds to Elizabeth's kind of provocation about the ghosts and the holograms and the porousness of these media as well. We noticed recently in doing some work with children on video games and physical play in the playground, and what happens when they take a narrative from a video game they played at home and then play it out on the playground, where all of the sort of, the visuals of the game have disappeared, so it's become invisible. All they have is their own bodies in the playground. And there's a sort of palimpsest effect where the game in their imagination is kind of spread over the playground, and only they can see it, or the other kids playing the game can see it. All anybody else can see is kids running around the playground, but in their mind, there's commandos and deserts and AK-47s and people shouting in Arabic and so on. So I think that kind of operates within the context of theatre as well, and within the context of games. I'm kind of imagining, Elizabeth, that's something that your kind of porousness and the ghosts of the holograms has something of that in it as well, maybe.
And I would only just add to that, because something that I was thinking about as we went into this conversation about theorizing the different levels of immersion that are represented in the three papers actually that we've been talking about: qualities of immersion on the one hand, of what it means to be sitting at a screen and and moving my avatar through space with my keyboard or with my PlayStation controller, or making a game as the students did is quite a different sense of a relationship of immersion in that case. And then also, Elizabeth, your augmented reality worlds. I mean, and the only thing we would add on top of that, for those of you who have experienced Tenderclaw's version of The Tempest, which is a virtual reality, a version of a Shakespeare play, in which I think that experience of immersion is also very complex, because it, in a different way, engages the relationship between the capacities of your own body and the capacities of your avatar in the space. Because I always say, I can't fly. There are things I can't do magic spells. But there are ways in which I feel very acutely often in gaming and virtual reality worlds of this both connect and disconnect between the presence of my body in the virtual world and what and what my avatar can do. So I think it's not a seamless relationship. Let's put it that way.
Yeah,
and I
and
think
the relationship, also the relationship between design and immersion, as you just said, Rebecca, I noticed in your chapter on time and games, and I think you repeated it in your talk, that the multiple functions that we play, we're sort of actor, script writer, director, designer, player, author, all of these things at the same time, and the relationship between those functions kind of shifts all the time. But we noticed actually when the kids are designing the games that they're kind of simultaneously also their own first players. As they design them, they kind of play them as they go along as well. So it's you know, the two functions kind of bleed into each other.
Thank you. I can see we've got a few more questions, so I'm going to try to zip through as many as I can. One is actually in the chat, and it sort of connects with this question about performance and gaming. It's from Benjamin, and he says he remembers hearing about gamers staging performances, maybe during lockdown, of Shakespeare and other dramas within the worlds of video games, such as Grand Theft Auto, with their avatars as the actors. How does this fit into the relationship between classical text and video game VR environments, particularly the idea of game or VR environments as a performance space? So we've all have already talked about that performance space a bit, but if there are any further thoughts about then when this gets kind of, I suppose, activated in games that are maybe, you know, well, in this case, a very famous commercial game, be interested to hear.
So
this is kind of a machinima question, isn't it?
Yeah,
this is
that's
reminding me of
what I was gonna
machinima, you know, which seems to have disappeared a little bit, or is it still going? I mean, there was a big fuss about machinima when people started acting out using avatars and virtual worlds in game spaces, and then re-editing them in editing software to kind of make animated movies. It reminds me a little bit of that. Although, I mean, on the other hand, it does remind me a little bit of kind of Goffman and dramaturgy and the presentation of self in everyday life. That, you know, when are we not? When are we not on the stage performing performing something? You know, whether it's a tragedy or just the kind of quotidian existence that we all live in.
I'm so glad you said machinima, Andrew, because that is when these experiments started in social VR. The first thing I thought of was the machinima projects. That they kind of were there for a minute and then they disappeared. And so I wonder if who is it that asked this question, Benjamin, that when social VR became possible, or even multiplayer games, but really there's not the ability to like go. I guess you could kind of get in a multiplayer game of Grand Theft Auto and go and just watch people. Kind of very transgressively doing theater in the middle of Grand Theft Auto, which is magic and also a very theater thing to do. Like whatever the new toy is, actors are going to be like, can we use that toy to put up a play? That's all we want to do is just put on shows wherever that. And so when the stages got taken away, I can see how that drove. But the project that Rebecca was talking about that underpresents Tempest. Or no, I guess it was Tender Claws is the over company for them, the Tempest. And then also there's a project called Finding Pandora X from Double I Studios, which is a social VR project that I'm writing about right now that won the Venice Biennial in 2020, which was a pandemic project where all the actors were, HP sponsored it, and the actors were kind of spread all over the world. And they got in their VR headsets, and then you as an audience member bought a ticket, and then you went into AltSpace VR and you showed up at a certain time, and then you were part of this kind of group project to go and recover Pandora, and all of the actors played different gods. So I think that as that, again, I think this is a question of tech infrastructure. The headsets are $300 now for VR headsets. Once there are inexpensive augmented reality versions, and the tech infrastructure for augmented reality doesn't allow people to kind of geolocate in a group in the way that social VR does, is it involves a whole geography piece. It's not there yet, but once that piece becomes part of the tech infrastructure puzzle, I think you're going to see a lot more of these projects that look like, you know, live machinima across these different tech platforms.
Wonderful, thank you so much. There are a couple of comments and questions that I'm going to see, they kind of might roll together. They're both about role-playing games. One is a comment from Sanjeev who says, it's not really a question, but they wanted to share an experience of playing a game that was an adaptation of Agatha Christie's novel. It was a role-playing game called Peril at the End House, which allows players to deduce and solve murders, and the cutscenes were comic styled. And I see as well, moving from the digital role-playing games to analog or tabletop ones, Georgie Rowe asks if anyone has come across the wide variety of non-high fantasy TTRPGs, which I'm pretty sure is tabletop role-playing games, which to her mind is where most adaptations of classics reside within video games. So the examples she gives are Good Society, based on the works of Jane Austen. And she adds to that question that she thinks that these sorts of games are more prone to, or I suppose people who make these games are more prone to adapting an author's full catalog and tone as opposed to a particular work, as they are even more player-driven than video games, with a game master guiding rather than leading players, as game developers do. So if anyone has any kind of thoughts or responses to those comments and questions, or maybe more generally to the relationship between digital games and immersive experiences and analog, do we see them as sort of continuous, part of the same family of experiences? Are there significant differences, maybe categorical differences, when you're talking about playing on a tabletop versus, a screen?
I have a thought about the Agatha Christie game. I mean, I've just been playing one actually with a colleague. This is the Murder on the Orient Express game, which is, I mean, the interesting thing about it, it kind of makes me think in a way, my abiding preoccupation is always how do these games reveal the fact that the literary text was already a kind of game. And in the context of detective fiction, that's really kind of obvious. I mean, that the whole thing is the game's afoot, the Sherlock Holmes dictum. So it's all a game in all kinds of very obvious ways. And the figure of the detective, which becomes the kind of proxy for the player in some kind of way, is like a game figure who has to sort of march their way through the various counters and challenges and rewards and quantified elements to get to the end. So that's just a thought about detective fiction.
Thank you. And Rebecca, did you have something?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking, I think there is an important distinction. Well, I'm thinking about first the distinction between the to be or not to be in book form as opposed to in digital game form, and in that sense, I don't think, the difference between a choose your own adventure in an analog form, kind of as opposed to a digital form, I don't think it's that different, However, I do think the experience of a, and because it's really just a text-based game. The to be or not to be is still a text-based. It's text. It doesn't involve an experience of being in time. And so for me, what's very important about video gaming, which, as I said, brought me to it in the first place, as opposed to, I don't do tabletop role-playing games, and so I don't have thoughts about them at this point, and mostly what I've thought about in terms of media are text, film, and video gaming is the difference of the temporal experience and the ways in which in video gaming in particular, your experience is often very time limited and time intense, and that sense engages you in a different way than an analog, to me, than an analog game. And put quite aside sort of the experience of the visual and the ways in which a visually created environment engages you differently. But again, that's to me, a lot of it has to do with the experience of temporality, which is so central to the experience of theater in particular and drama in particular.
Just thought about tabletop role-playing games and RPGs in general. I don't know if this is what the questioner, whose name I've lost, actually, who is it?
It's Georgie.
Georgie.
Sorry, it's gone into the answered section, so sorry, it might have disappeared from view.
Okay. Well, I don't know if this is what you had in mind, but I mean, it seems to me that one feature of tabletop and digital role-playing games is the dice rolling. The multi-sided dice, which in digital versions becomes incorporated into the game engine. So it's about what Kaiwa called the aspect of play, which he called alia, which is the Latin for dice. It's the element of chance. And so, we could talk about what's the element of chance in literature. And it's there. I mean, it's there in Macbeth in relation to the prophecies, of course. If chance will have me king, then chance may crown me. So, it plays a part in the unfolding of possibilities within literary narrative, I guess, though in literature it always has to be closed down rather than opened up. But maybe that's the question. What's the part that the dice plays in literature and literary narrative?
I think also about rules. That one of the interesting things for me in sitting down to make the Macbeth video game was the way that video games are just a set of rules about what can and can't happen in a given game, and then applying that lens to a literary source is a really great way to illuminate the rule systems at play within these sources, especially when there is an authoritative source. And I'm using that word in the kind of Stephen Orwell loosely, like what you would expect to buy in a text if you went to the bookstore and bought a copy of Macbeth. Like there's going to be some variation, but in overall, like this, we all understand what we're talking about here. We're not at the level of like printing and it's an S, it's an F. But as opposed to kind of the stories where there are lots of variations, maybe like ancient Greek mythology or those, but like where there is a reasonably authoritative printed version. I can hear W.B. Worthing screaming from Columbia about how the text is not originary for the performance. Anyway, we know what we're talking about. There's a version of Macbeth that is recognizable as Shakespeare's Macbeth, and there's a way to illuminate the rule system of that by transferring it to a video game format. So when we sat down to build something wicked, like what are you allowed to do in the world of Macbeth? How do you win? You win by backstabbing. Even King Duncan is like, oh, great. You also win by being a vicious warrior, like vicious. You have to have a sword that smokes with bloody execution. You can't get out of there and shake everybody's hand on the battlefield. And that earns praise even from Angelic Duncan, that you have. So then we built that rule system into something wicked. And it doesn't allow you to play outside of the rule system as visible in Shakespeare's Macbeth. Banquo has to get in your way. You can't kill Banquo in this first episode. The Kerns and the Gallowglasses have to be killed or else you die. So I think that thinking about the ways in which a classical or a classic source has a system of rules that are operating within its society, video games are a really effective way to illuminate that, to illuminate those rule systems. And that's what we went for with Something Wicked. That I think also in a tabletop role-playing game, which I also don't really play, but I understand there's like a person who's basically the keeper of the rules. The video game structure, the design of it kind of can stand in for the, what they call dungeon masters or whoever's in charge of like, you're allowed to do this, but not this. I think the tool of a video game plays that role.
Wonderful, thank you all. Well, what I'm going to try to do is sort of roll a couple of questions together for our last bit, because we're in the final 5 minutes. I'm also going to put a bit of information in the chat about the next event, but I'll combine a couple of comments and questions. Yes, and Deborah says we'll make sure that we keep them and answer them on the website. Some of the questions that are remaining, I think we're thinking about teaching games and how to use them in the classroom. Amy's question doesn't explicitly mention teaching, but I think it's a question that would come up a lot for teachers. So I'll read hers and then also Costas's together. When adapting classics, is there a way to preserve the original author's wording or language while also making the dialogue easier for modern readers or players to understand? Costas asks, he has a really interesting comment, thank you Costas, about his own experience in Greece. He asks, what are the possible obstacles for video games becoming eventually a stable literature learning in our schools? And then finally, a question that I have a feeling there's not an answer for, but maybe it's a prompt to us of something that could be done from Ariel. Where might I find a list of quality video games focused on classics that could be suggested for high school students? So I've rolled together some really various questions, but maybe if each of our panelists wanted to take a minute to sort of any closing thoughts they have about these comments and questions, or just about the discussion that we've had today, that would be wonderful. And I'll go ahead and say thank you again to all of you for your time.
I'll just say something really quickly because I think I wanted more time to Elizabeth and Andrew on this one. But I will say, when I taught, for many years recently, my undergraduate course on tragedy, which began, probably began with Oedipus, we always ended with video games. And part of the purpose of that was to what I always wanted to show the students is that the world in which they swim every day and the games that they play, this is where it comes from. That they could see the deep structure of the games that they, video games that they were playing, were embedded in Shakespeare or embedded in, Oedipus. That was an important pedagogical tool for me. That they understood it wasn't just, it wasn't just about games and games breaking down the plays, but they're also to understand that their games, as Elizabeth said so well, I mean, they are driven by deeply embedded rules of narrative that stretch back, thousands of years. And that was a really important thing for me to show them.
I would just say that the collection, I dropped the link in way at the beginning of the thread, in Classical Antiquity and Video Games, has a lot of, they talk about a lot of good video games, specifically about ancient Greece. And I think maybe ancient Roman stuff also. So that's a specific resource that talks about video games with those depictions. But I would just endorse the use of video games as a lean-in medium, a lean-forward medium. So Jane McGonigal's the lean forward and the lean back. I don't remember if she's the one who came up with that phrase, but because they're participatory, you have to have the user, or they don't work. It's not just sit and watch, it's be part of the story. That's what makes them really effective. So whether it's something as robust for the kind of deep learning that Andrew's work promotes, or a bell ringer at the beginning of class of 5 minutes, I think that thinking about video games and these classical texts is a way to get students into that subject position of being in the story. And that's second only to putting up plays, which you can't do in 5 minutes at the beginning of your class. I think they're really effective, and so I would encourage that.
Thanks, guys. And if I can just add 3 quick points at the end. I think they're kind of objections, actually. I think one is that video games are not there for learning about literature. Video games are a cognate storytelling form with film and literature. You look at them together and you think, well, as Rebecca has done, what are the differences between them and what are the similarities? How are they all the kind of drama? How are they all the kind of narrative form? And that's a different way to think about them. Secondly, to say that asking your learners to design a video game is very different from asking them to play a video game. And it's not so different from asking them to realize the play on stage or realize it in film. And for that reason, my final objection is actually to the concept of adaptation. In a way, this is no more an adaptation than staging a version. We wouldn't call a stage version in Stratford an adaptation of a Shakespeare play. And I don't think we should call the film version of it that either. And for that reason, I don't think we should call the video game version of it an adaptation either. Linda Hutcheon explores these problems with adaptation in her kind of classic work very well, I think, but I would go a little bit further. So maybe some contribution to make to the forthcoming special issue in the adaptation journal, Deborah.
That's wonderful. Thank you all so much. Sorry, Deborah, did you want to add something?
No, I was trying to unmute, sorry. No, thanks for that, Andrew. And I've just put on the chat to everyone that we'll answer the questions that we haven't been able to cover on the website. Sorry, I accidentally just sent my message to the host. So it's so thank you very much. I'll just say that now. because we're running out of time. But thanks to Andrew and to Rebecca and to Elizabeth for fabulous talks. I've been absolutely enthralled.
Completely agree. Thank you all so much. So much to think about. Thank you also for the suggestions for further reading. We'll be taking those up. Thank you so much to the audience for all of your questions and engagement. And yeah, our next event, I put it in the chat, although it's a few hand claps back, will be on the 20th of April. You can sign up with the link there. It's about access and inclusivity with digital work and digital adaptations, if we can use that phrase after Andrew's provocation, which I appreciate. Great, thanks so much, everyone. And reminder that there will be a little survey that pops up hopefully when you finish this call. So if you're able to spend a minute filling it in, we'd be really grateful. Thanks, everyone.